Hi, and welcome to today's Daily Chronicle. Today is Thursday, December 11th, 2025. The use and misuse of the word ideology. The word ideology has become a fixture in American political rhetoric, invoked by leaders to cast opponents' beliefs as dangerous, stupid, or unfounded. During the 2024 presidential campaign, Donald Trump vowed to defeat the toxic poison of gender ideology, saying he would take historic action to reaffirm that he described as a divinely created gender binary. Education Secretary Linda McMahon has similarly criticized DEI ideologies in hiring and admissions, arguing instead for merit-based practices. Utah Governor Spencer Cox has said leftist ideology motivated the alleged assassin of Charlie Kirk. Those on the left have used the term as well. Scholar Brad Onishi, author of the book Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next, describes Christian nationalism as an ideology, asserting that the United States was founded as and should remain a Christian nation. It wasn't always this way for this installment of NPR's Word of the Week. Let's trace ideology back to its origin during the French Enlightenment. Philosopher Antoine de Tracy coined ideology as a neutral concept for the scientific study of ideas, said Samuel Chan, who teaches political thought at Occidental College. De Tracy thought that an idea should be studied and interrogated the same way science studied the natural world. He believed this study of ideas could help bolster Enlightenment ideas of liberalism, including personal liberty and private property. But Napoleon quickly turned it into a pejorative to attack political opponents. Influenced by de Tracy, whose Republican and liberal commitments conflicted with his own ambitions. Essentially, Napoleon described those who questioned his military might and authoritarian tendencies as ideologues, in part because they favored legislative powers over executive power. Karl Marx later adopted the word to describe what he saw as a false consciousness among workers who supported the interests of the ruling class. If laborers failed to revolt, Marx argued it was because they were beholden to the ideology of the ruling class, Chan said. Today, ideology has essentially become a form of name-calling, says Jason Blakely, a political scientist at Pepperdine University, and author of Lost in Ideology. He argues conservatives often deploy the term to describe what they view as faddish beliefs that threaten traditional moral orders, while liberals use it to criticize inherited hierarchies they see as limiting human flourishing. Chan favors other words, worldview, or narrative to describe how communities understand their histories and assign meaning to their lives. That framing, he said, can create greater empathy across political and cultural lines. Blakely offers a different approach. Treat ideology more like religion. People think their religion is true, he said, but they also understand it's a cultural tradition. that you have to speak out of and persuade people into, demonstrating the merits of one's own viewpoint. He added, may prove more effective than dismissing others' beliefs outright. Feeling burned out? There's a word for that in Mandarin Chinese. Involution, an obscure term used in agricultural economics, leaped from the pages of academia into the Chinese meme world and then became part of the Chinese government policy making. If you are feeling dispirited at work or burned out by the general pressure, of life, there is a perfect word for you. Involution. The Mandarin Chinese word for involution, neizhuan, is now a ubiquitous slang term. It has struck a chord when students exhausted by relentless academic competition, parents overwhelmed by social expectations, and workers constantly filling overtime shifts. So for this installment of Word of the Week, we explore the evolution of involution. Involution first appeared in English with its modern connotation of futility in 1963. Academic Tract by American anthropologist Clifford Geertz. On Dutch colonial society in Indonesia, he had observed people working harder than ever on the land, but yielding less and less food. The term then bounced around niche academic circles. Scholar Philip Huang used it in a seminal study, trying to explain why capitalism did not organically develop in the 20th century. Then the term appeared in a study of tax collectors in the earliest 20th century China. Percent Dora, now a professor at Duke University, had noticed that these tax collectors were actually not that good at forcing peasants to pay up. This suggested to me that there was this involution. He says, Duara's resulting book, Culture, Power, and the State, was later translated into Chinese. But how to translate involution? Book translators came up with the phrase neihuan, combining the Mandarin words for inner, nei, and to curl or to roll, huan, invoking this idea of cycling endlessly back into oneself. Neihuan, as a Mandarin term, might have stayed in academic parlance, if not for the coronavirus pandemic in early 2020. I still vividly remember I gave a long interview to a Chinese journalist, says Bao Xiang, a director at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Germany. In the 2020 interview with Chinese outlet Sixth Tone, he set down the first definition of how neihuan is now used, to pinpoint a general feeling of ennui, when trapped in what he called an endless cycle of self-flagellation. We have to intensify your effort, competing with other people for no purpose, yet you cannot quit, he explained to NPR. His interview with the Sixth Tone went viral, and from there, Ne Huan took off among the Chinese public. I somehow just put the words to what people already know and already feel. People in China use Ne Huan to describe something useless or doing something just for appearances. Then Ne Huan got memeified, for example. A video of an elite Chinese university student studying on his laptop, even while biking at night, providing a visual emblem for the absurdity of Ne Huan behavior. Now the word's path has taken another twist. Ne Huan has entered the official bureaucratic lexicon. In 2024, China's top economic official, Li Zhang, criticized spiraling involution in the economy, describing a chronic problem where too many Chinese companies are competing with each other and producing the same thing. Then, this year, Chinese policymakers, led by the country's top leader, Xi Jinping, kicked off their anti-involution campaign to crack down on this overcapacity in production. So the term has come full circle to its roots, describing unproductive economic activity. Might one say the word Ne Huan has made a full involution? Regulation of translation. sRNAs that are complementary to the mRNA. Bacteria have hundreds of different small RNAs, sRNAs, that bind on top of the RBS in an mRNA, preventing the ribosome from binding and translating the mRNA. Riboswitches. Riboswitches are a segment of an mRNA that binds a small molecule, changing the conformation of the mRNA, and so hiding or exposing the RBS. Riboswitches function similarly to a transcriptional regulatory protein, except instead of having a protein bind to an allosteric regulator to change the conformation of the protein in order to regulate transcription. Here, an mRNA binds to a small molecule that changes conformation of the mRNA in order to regulate translation. Two-component signal transduction systems. Two-component signal transductions systems are an incredibly common way that bacteria change their gene expression or behavior in response to the environment. 1. A sensor kinase. The sensor kinase is a dimer that autophosphorylates in response to a signal. Sensing domain. Detects, binds some small molecule or protein. Usually, this is an extracellular domain. The sensor kinase is a transmembrane protein, and the detected molecule is outside the cell. Autokinase domain, histone kinase, cytoplasmic, uses ATP to phosphorylate the other half of the dimer. A histidine H is phosphorylated. 2. Response regulator. The phosphate from a specific sensor kinase is passed to its cognate, or its partner, response regulator. When phosphorylated, the response regulator influences cell behavior. Regulatory domain and aspartic acid receives the phosphate from the autokinase domain. No new ATP is used in phosphorylating the regulatory domain, and there is no amplification of the signal. Response domain influences cell behavior when the regulatory domain is phosphorylated. Often it is a transcription factor, in which case phosphorylation permits DNA binding. A constitutively active phosphatase limits the duration of the signal. Phosphorylase systems use additional histine and aspartate containing proteins or domains to pass the phosphate from the sensor kinase to the response regulator. This allows for more complicated regulation and decision making. Bacterial growth. Factors affecting growth rates. So, species, nutrient type, amount, salinity, temperature, pH, and oxygen are different factors that affect bacterial growth. At too high temperature, proteins unfold and membranes become too fluid and so permeable. At too low a temperature, the membrane becomes less fluid, and chemical reactions can get easily over their activation barrier. Each organism tailors its components so that at the temperature at which the organisms normally live, its lipid and proteins have just the right amount of dynamics to perform their function, but still retain their structure. Enzymes from extremophiles have practical uses in lab and commercially. Cell cycle. During any cell cycle, a cell must double in size. The DNA must be replicated. The chromosomes must be segregated, and the cell must divide. In eukaryotic cells, these processes are non-overlapping and occur in a strict order, not so for bacteria. DNA replication. Structure for the bacterial chromosome. Unlike eukaryotic chromosomes, bacterial chromosomes are relatively short and circular. Like eukaryotic chromosomes, they are supercoiled and condensed. Condensation proteins include proteins that function like histones. DNA is wrapped around them. Proteins that pin together loops of DNA and topoisomerases. Circular chromosomes do not need telomeres, but topology problems occur during replication, i.e. overwinding and concatenation of the two replicated chromosomes. These problems are resolved by topoisomerases that resolves concatenation problems. Gyrase is a target for some antibiotics. Identification of DNA replication proteins. Proteins necessary for DNA replication were first identified in E. coli using a combination of both genetic and biochemical techniques. Biochemical purification in vitro assay for replication. It's cell lysate plus DNA template plus radioactive dNTPs to replication radioactive DNA polymer. Biochemical fractionation. Fractionate cell lysate into pools of proteins based on arbitrary biochemical properties. Test each fraction pool of proteins for whether it can replicate DNA. Fractionate further until you have a pure protein or protein complex. Then study the biochemical properties of your purified protein. Use genetics to identify all genes involved in replication. Randomly mutate a population of cells. Some cells will happen to have a mutation in a gene necessary for the process you're interested in. Identify cells with the phenotype you're looking for. Example, can't replicate their DNA. Clone and sequence the genes, method to be discussed later in the semester. Use temperature-sensitive mutations to study essential genes. Essential cell functions can only be studied using temperature-sensitive mutations or other types of conditional mutations. The mutant cells can be grown at low temperatures. For E. coli, 30 degrees, where the mutant protein is active and the cell is healthy. After enough cells have grown up, the cells are then shifted to the higher temperature. For E. coli, 42 degrees. By observing the first thing that goes wrong at this higher temperature, you can determine which process the mutant protein was necessary for. At longer times after the cell dies, lots of things will be going wrong. Example, the cell may lyse, macromolecules will start to break down, etc. But the first thing to go wrong after you raise the temperature will be related to the function of the protein with the temperature-sensitive mutation. Temperature-sensitive mutations typically reduce the stability of a protein structure and so cause it to unfold at moderately high temperatures. Only the temperature-sensitive protein unfolds at this moderately high temperature. It is not so hot that other proteins unfold. The assay for mutations in DNA replication genes. Add radioactive dNTPs to the media that cells are growing in. If replication can occur, the cells will incorporate radioactivity into their DNA polymers. But if a replication gene is not functional, no radioactivity will be incorporated. Rising temperatures could have a chilling impact on young children. A Palestinian woman uses a plastic plate to fan a baby during a heat wave in Gaza in 2024. Young children really struggle in the heat. Their bodies are too small to cool down by sweating. Like adults, and they're wholly reliant on grown-ups to find any kind of relief, be it air conditioning or shade or a cool drink. Now, new research points to a potentially lifelong setback for little ones exposed to extreme heat, which is becoming more common due to climate change. In a study of nearly 20,000 kids, young children who experienced hotter temperatures than usual were less likely to meet basic developmental milestones. than those living in nearby but slightly cooler areas. Researchers report in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, children in lower income households and urban areas were especially vulnerable. Early childhood is a sensitive period of development, says George Cuartas, a researcher at New York University who led the study. If we experience excessive stress without a buffer, that can lead to long-lasting impacts on brain and skill development. As temperatures rise around the globe, researchers are scrambling to study the impacts on human health. They've linked the extreme heat to increased risk of heart attacks, anxiety, depression, and premature birth, says Cuartas. But there was nothing about early childhood development. In the first few years of life, we develop key physical, cognitive, and social skills that can shape the rest of our lives. Meeting these basic developmental milestones at the appropriate time, including being able to grasp objects with 2 fingers, recognizing letters or words, and playing independently, can influence later life outcomes, from mental health to economic success. Delays in developing these skills set kids down a developmental pathway that can affect not just individual well-being, but society as a whole, says Cuartas. To see if extreme heat impacted the development of these skills, Cuartas and his colleagues analyzed data for nearly 20,000 3- and 4-year-olds from Gambia, Georgia, Madagascar, Malawi, Palestinian territories, and Sierra Leone. These places collect data on early childhood development in similar ways and have detailed climate records, allowing the researchers to look for links between heat and development. Links emerged. Children living in areas where the average monthly high topped 86 degrees Fahrenheit at any time during their life were about 5 to 7% points less likely to be developed on track that children who lived in the same general area but experienced temps about 9 degrees cooler. Cognitive milestones, especially those related to learning to read and do math, were more likely to be affected than physical or social milestones. That may sound like a small change, but applied across a whole region, it's a lot of kids, says Cuartas. In their whole sample of nearly 20,000 kids, approximately 63% of children were developmentally on track, reducing that to 5 to 7 percentage points in the study sample alone, is about 1,000 children. Even a slight decrease can have a significant consequences for our society as a whole. Marshall Burke, an environmental economist at Stanford University, who wasn't involved in the research, agrees. The study is well done and the findings consistent with the growing body of research that shows that early life exposure to climate extremes can have really lasting impacts on health and livelihoods. The study cannot say how extreme heat is causing these delays, but there are several theories. Lots of research suggests heat can dull thinking and slow learning, that's consistent with their findings on literacy and numeracy, says Burke. Extreme heat can also raise the risk of violence within a family, according to previous research by Cuartas. Extreme heat can make parents more impulsive, irritable, and aggressive, he says. When that's directed towards children, it can harm their development. Heat can also mess with children's sleep, which is essential for growth and development. Or extreme weather could close off opportunities to learn and play, an important part of growing up. Maybe children are having more difficulties attending early childhood education and care centers. Or spending time outdoors because it's too hot, says Cuartas. Whatever the cause, the harms of heat were not evenly distributed. Children from lower income families, those who lived in urban areas, and those who had a harder time accessing clean water and sanitation were especially vulnerable, researchers found. Such children face more barriers to get away from the heat, says Lindsay Bogart, a pediatrician and chief science officer at the Center of the Developing Child at Harvard University, who was not involved in the study. Especially in lower income countries, they may live in a house without air conditioning, or their neighborhood may have a few trees to provide shade. Those barriers add up. You can think of it sort of like a seesaw, she says. Extreme heat can weigh hard on one side, but that weight can be offset. The study, she says, points to where we need to step in to protect children. Investments to ensure access to clean water is key. For example, and while air conditioning may not be realistic in many countries, there are other strategies. In terms of buildings and structures, shade is one of the most powerful tools, says Burgart. So preserving green space, planting trees, and planning development with heat mitigation in mind could help. Scaled up, such interventions could tip things toward positive development.